Hello, this is the thought for the day for Friday the 19th of June, and today we're looking at Psalm 81, and my name is Pam Cribbin. This psalm looks back at what God's done for his people in the past, but then it asks the question, where are we now? And perhaps it will encourage us to ask the same question, where are we now? I'll read the first few verses, verses 1 to 5. Sing for joy to God our strength, shout aloud to the God of Jacob. Begin the music, strike the tambourine, play the melodious harp and lyre. Sound the ram's horn at the new moon, and when the moon is full on the day of our feast. This is a decree for Israel, an ordinance for the God of Jacob. When God went out against Egypt, he established it as a statute for Joseph. So this seems to have been written for one of Israel's annual festivals, which started with the Feast of Trumpets, which sounds like a rather noisy festival, which was on the day of the new moon, and ended with the Feast of Tabernacles 2 weeks later on the day of the full moon. So that explains the references to the new moon and the full moon. So way back in the time when God had saved his people from their life as slaves, he commanded them to remember these events in an annual celebration. And it seems as if hundreds of years later, Israel was still keeping this command and celebrating this festival. However, the psalm continues like this. I heard an unknown voice say, I removed the burden from their shoulders, their hands were set free from the basket. In your distress you called and I rescued you. I answered you out of a thundercloud. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Hear me, my people, and I will warn you, if you would only listen to me, Israel. You shall have no foreign god among you. You shall not worship any god other than me. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt. Open wide your mouth, and I will fill it. I heard an unknown voice. We obviously know that this voice was God's voice, but why does the psalmist call it an unknown voice? What does this unknown voice, is it because the people have wandered so far away from God that they no longer recognize his voice? What does this unknown voice say to them? It reminds them of how he rescued them when they cried out to him in distress. He removed their burden. He tested them as well to see if they would follow him or not, and he told them to worship only him and not any other god. He gives them a wonderful promise, open wide your mouth and I will fill it, which perhaps reminds us of the baby birds that some of us have been enjoying watching during the last few weeks. Would you turn away from a God who's done so much for you and who is longing to give you so much more? It seems like the Israelites had, and if we are honest, all of us also have at some time. And then this unknown voice continues. But my people would not listen to me. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices. Sometimes it seems God lets us go our own way, even though he knows it's not the best way for us, so that eventually we'll realize God was right after all. It reminds us of the story of the prodigal son that Jesus taught, which you can read in Luke chapter 15. It wasn't in the son's best interest to go off and spend all his inheritance in wild living, but the father let him do it because perhaps it was the only way the son would eventually come to his senses and return to his home and his father, where he belonged. And then, of course, instead of getting the reception he deserved, he was met with wide open arms and a party. This is how the spirit of the psalm continues. If my people would only listen to me, if Israel would only follow my ways, how quickly I would subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate the Lord would cringe before him, and their punishment would last forever. But you would be fed with the finest of wheat. With honey from the rock, I would satisfy you. Our 21st century Western mindset finds the references to enemies rather strange, but if the concept of physical enemies might be less relevant, we still face enemies, perhaps hopelessness, fear, doubt, illness, even the coronavirus. But God promises to those who listen to him and follow his ways that he will feed them with the finest of wheat and with honey from the rock. We, of course, can look at this psalm and all the psalms through New Testament eyes, and we see that Jesus promised his followers what we could call spiritual food, knowing that we're loved and that our lives have meaning in him, having a sense of peace and purpose, and that we're forgiven for all the times when we haven't listened to God and followed him. So let's go back to verse 5, which for me is the saddest verse in the psalm. I heard an unknown voice. I don't want God's voice to be an unknown voice to me. I want to recognize his voice the moment he speaks. Does God still speak today? Many Christians believe that he does, and I've certainly had times when I believe he's spoken to me, although not always when I want or saying exactly what I want to hear. He may speak through a prompting. Why don't you ring so-and-so? Or you may be reading the Bible and a particular verse seems to jump out of the page, or a word from a talk or a sermon might be just what you need to hear, or a comment from a friend or something in the world around us which grabs our attention. There are probably no limits to the ways in which God wants to speak to us, and you could probably add to the list. But the important thing is that if God's voice has become an unknown voice to us, let's learn to recognize him again. And if we need to ask someone else to help us to do this, let's ask them. So to return to the question we asked at the beginning, where are we now? Are we listening to God's voice and following him, whatever that might mean for each one of us? He is waiting to feed us.